The morning began with the kind of crisp, golden light that makes the Montana backcountry look like a painting. Pine needles glistening with dew, air so clear it felt like you could see 100 miles in every direction. Emily Hart tightened the straps of her hiking pack in the gravel parking lot of the Absaroka Ridge trailhead, her boots crunching softly underfoot. She had been here many times before. The mountains had always been her escape from the noise of daily life, her place to breathe. This trip was meant to be short, a single-day loop that would take her up past the high meadow, across a ridge, and back down before sundown. She checked her watch, noted the time, and smiled to herself. Plenty of daylight. Before heading out, she stopped at the small general store near the trailhead, its faded, open sign swaying lazily in the breeze. The place smelled of coffee and cedar chips. She bought a couple of bottles of water, a bag of trail mix, and a chocolate bar, exchanging a few friendly words with the store's owner, an older man with a sun-weathered face. He had seen her around before, always alone, always heading into the wilderness with a quiet confidence. "Stay safe out there," he said, glancing at the weather report pinned to the wall. "Supposed to stay clear all day, but you know these mountains, things change fast." She nodded, gave a little laugh, and promised she'd be back before dark. The trail began with a gradual incline through lodgepole pine and spruce, the air filled with the scent of sap and the distant murmur of a creek. Her boots found their rhythm quickly, crunching over pine needles and the occasional patch of loose stone. Birds darted between branches, and somewhere far off, a woodpecker tapped against a hollow trunk. Emily stopped once to adjust the strap across her chest, feeling the familiar pull of her pack, the comforting weight of everything she needed for the day resting on her back. She took out her phone to snap a few photos, the jagged silhouette of the peaks against the morning sky, a patch of wildflowers blooming defiantly near a cluster of boulders. The reception bars were already dropping, and she knew that soon she'd be completely out of service. That was part of the appeal. No messages, no news alerts, no buzzing notifications, just her and the trail. By the time she reached the first ridge, the sun was high enough to paint the valley below in warm gold. She paused to sip water, gazing at the way the light filtered through the mist still clinging to the lower slopes. Somewhere in that view was the reason she kept coming back, the reminder that there were still places in the world untouched, wild, and indifferent to human schedules. A pair of deer startled and bounded away through the brush as she continued on, their white tails flashing like quick beacons. The trail narrowed here, winding between rocks slick with moss, and she slowed her pace, careful with her footing. Up ahead, a fork in the path appeared. She knew the loop continued left, but she glanced right at the lesser-used track. It looked overgrown, a ribbon of dirt disappearing into shadow. She hesitated, shifting her weight from one boot to the other, listening to the stillness of the mountains around her. No one was close behind. No one was ahead. Emily stepped forward. The days following Emily Hart's disappearance blurred into a whirlwind of activity and rising dread. When she failed to return that evening, her absence was first met with mild concern. Perhaps she had lingered to watch the sunset or taken a wrong turn that delayed her hike. But when her friends and family couldn't reach her by phone and her car was still sitting alone at the Absaroka Ridge trailhead the next morning, the alarm bells began to ring. Search and rescue crews were called in immediately. The early days brought a swarm of volunteers, locals who knew the terrain, seasoned hikers who understood how quickly the mountains could turn treacherous. They scoured the well-marked loop, then pushed deeper into the surrounding forest. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their blades chopping the thin mountain air as spotters scanned for flashes of color, anything that might be her clothing or gear. On the ground, rangers and search dogs fanned out along every ridge and gully, calling her name until their voices cracked. The first break came within hours, but it wasn't much of one. Her car sat locked at the trailhead, dust already gathering on the hood. Inside was nothing unusual: her phone charger, a water bottle, a folded map she hadn't taken with her. Her keys were found on the ground near the driver's side, as if she had dropped them in haste or without noticing. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric, no footprints indicating that someone else had been there. The search pushed on for a week, then two. Each day without results deepened the unease. The official story began to fracture into competing theories. Some whispered she'd been attacked by a wild animal. Grizzly sightings weren't rare in the Absarokas. But rangers pointed out there was no sign of a bear mauling, no blood, no scraps of clothing, no disturbed earth. Others suggested she had fallen somewhere remote, her body hidden by dense undergrowth or swept into one of the icy rivers that cut through the canyons. But the dogs picked up no scent trails leading far from the established paths. As the days dragged into weeks, darker theories began to surface. Emily had been known to wander off the main routes, following game trails or exploring forgotten logging roads. The more remote the terrain, the higher the chance she had crossed paths with someone who didn't want to be found. In hushed tones, locals spoke of a solitary man said to live in a cabin deep in the forest, a figure who avoided town and who some claimed had run-ins with hikers in the past. No evidence linked him to Emily, but the rumor lodged itself in the community's mind like a splinter. Winter arrived early that year, forcing the search to scale back. Snow buried the trails, and the mountains became an unforgiving place for even the most seasoned outdoorsmen. Emily's family continued to push for answers, holding candlelight vigils in the small park downtown, her smiling face printed on flyers that slowly faded in the weather. Each anniversary of her disappearance brought a fresh round of media attention, but no new leads. By the fourth year, even the sheriff's department admitted that the case had gone cold. The file grew dusty in the evidence room, stuffed with maps, photographs, and interviews that seemed to lead nowhere. Her family clung to the only hope they could, that somewhere, somehow, Emily was still alive. But for the rest of the town, she became another name in Montana's long history of wilderness mysteries, a ghost of the Absaroka Mountains who had simply vanished into the trees. It was the kind of winter day when the cold didn't just bite, it settled deep into the bones, a steady, unyielding presence. The snow lay thick across the Montana backcountry, swallowing sound and softening the jagged lines of the mountains. Two hunters, Nate Rourke and his younger cousin Travis, trudged through the powder, their breath misting in the air. They were deep into a part of the forest few ventured into during this season, tracking elk that had drifted far from their usual grazing grounds. The sky was low and gray, promising more snow before nightfall. They had been moving for hours when Travis spotted it first, a crooked line of smoke-colored wood against the endless white. At first, it looked like nothing more than an odd shadow beneath a stand of spruce, but as they drew closer, the shape resolved into the outline of a small structure. It was a cabin, half hidden in a ravine, its roof bowed under years of accumulated snow and decay. The logs were blackened with age, and the shutters hung at odd angles, one banging faintly in the wind. Nate paused, narrowing his eyes. He'd hunted these woods since he was a boy and had never seen it before. Cabins out here weren't unheard of, old trappers' shacks, hunting lodges, or survival shelters, but most had been catalogued long ago. This one seemed forgotten, swallowed by the forest. They slid down the embankment toward it, their boots sinking into drifts. The air grew still, the sound of their own movement strangely loud in the hush. The front door was swollen shut from moisture, the wood warped and splintered. Nate leaned his rifle against the porch rail and pushed hard, the hinges groaning in protest until the door finally gave way with a crack. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp wood and rot. Dust lay thick on every surface. A narrow cot sat against one wall, its mattress collapsed inward like a forgotten grave. In the corner, a rusted potbelly stove leaned slightly, a pile of wood stacked beside it. Broken glass from a small window glittered faintly in the dim light. Travis moved cautiously, sweeping his flashlight across the walls, which were scarred with old nails and faint, scratched lines. He noticed a row of hooks by the door, empty, save for a length of frayed rope. The silence inside was different from the quiet of the forest. It felt enclosed, watchful, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. When they reached the hearth, Nate noticed something strange. The cabin's chimney, a squat column of stone, was blocked from the inside. The obstruction wasn't just soot buildup, it looked like debris had been deliberately stuffed into the flue. A tangle of sticks jutted from the opening, mixed with scraps of fabric stiffened by age. "What the hell is that?" Travis murmured, leaning closer. He reached out, pulling free a strip of faded cloth that disintegrated slightly in his gloved hand. More debris followed, twigs, chunks of charred wood, clumps of dirt. Then Nate's flashlight beam caught something pale wedged deep inside the chimney. The two men exchanged a glance. Nate crouched, bracing himself as he reached up into the narrow space. His fingers closed around something hard, cold, and unmistakably smooth. He pulled it free, and the weight in his hand made his stomach twist, A human skull, its empty socket staring back at him in the flickering light. Neither man spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of the wind pushing snow against the cabin walls. For a moment, neither Nate nor Travis moved. The skull sat in Nate's gloved hands, its pale bone stark against the dark soot that clung to it. Time seemed to collapse into a single, breathless moment, the eerie stillness of the cabin pressing in on them. Nate felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. The empty eye sockets stared through him, unblinking, as if holding onto a story no one wanted to hear. Travis took an involuntary step back, his flashlight beam trembling. That's human," he said, though the words came out more like a question. Nate nodded slowly, swallowing hard. He set the skull down carefully on the warped floorboards and turned back to the chimney. They cleared away more debris, the fabric now clearly identifiable as weathered clothing. The colors had long since faded, but a sleeve's torn cuff still clung stubbornly to the brittle bone beneath. As they pulled at the blockage, more of the remains shifted and fell into the cold hearth. A collapsed rib cage, the long curve of a femur, a spine still partially held together by stubborn ligaments that had outlasted flesh. The air grew heavy with an ancient, dry odor that made Travis gag. Among the skeletal debris, they found the remnants of a backpack, the nylon frayed and stiff with soot. Nate gingerly unzipped it. Inside were items dulled by time, a rusted pocketknife, a half-empty water bottle, and a battered wallet. The wallet's leather had hardened, but when Nate pried it open, a driver's license slid free. The photo was faded, but the name was still readable, Emily Hart. The recognition hit like a physical blow. Her disappearance had been a ghost story in the region for years, told in fragments around campfires and coffee shop tables. And now here she was, or what was left of her, wedged inside the chimney of a forgotten cabin miles from any known trail. Travis stepped back toward the door, his eyes scanning the dim corners of the cabin as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. "Why would she be in there?" he asked quietly. "How does that even happen?" Nate didn't answer. His mind was turning over the possibilities, each one darker than the last. If she had climbed down the chimney for shelter, she would have been trapped almost immediately. The narrow shaft, the slick soot, and the cold stone would have been impossible to escape. But there was something about the way the remains had been positioned, the way the debris was packed, that didn't feel like an accident. They stepped outside to breathe, the cabin looming behind them in the snow. Nate keyed his radio with stiff fingers, his voice clipped as he called in their location. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, promising to send deputies and forensic teams, warning them to remain on site. When the sheriff's department arrived an hour later, the cabin was swarming with activity. Investigators in heavy coats ducked inside, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. They photographed every angle of the chimney, bagged each fragment of bone, and collected the personal items. The sheriff himself stood just outside the doorway, his breath curling in the air as he studied the hunters. "You're sure no one's been living here?" he asked. Nate shook his head firmly. The dust, the decay, it was clear the place had been untouched for years. As the remains were carried out in sealed bags, a silence fell over the clearing. The mountains stood tall and indifferent, the snow continuing to fall in slow, steady flakes. Somewhere, deep in the timberline, an elk called out, the sound echoing through the cold air. Emily Hart had been found, but in a way that only deepened the mystery. And in that moment, Nate and Travis both understood, this discovery was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a far stranger one. The county coroner's office worked through the night, piecing together what remained of Emily Hart. 6 years in the elements had left her bones brittle and fragile, but some clues endured. The first report was enough to chill even the most seasoned investigators, multiple fractures to the skull and ribs, each consistent with blunt force trauma. They were not the kind of injuries one would expect from a fall down a chimney. And then there was the absence of certain items. Her hiking boots, her jacket, and her GPS watch, all missing from the scene. The strange carvings were what disturbed Sheriff Cale the most. Inside the cabin, etched faintly into the stone of the fireplace just above where Emily's body had been wedged, was a symbol, a rough, looping figure that looked like an eye surrounded by jagged rays. It was crudely done, as if scratched hastily with a knife or a sharp rock. The investigators photographed it from every angle, but no one could place its origin. It wasn't a known brand logo, a trail marker, or any recognized symbol in the region. When shown the image, one of the oldest trappers in town shook his head and muttered that it looked like something meant to keep spirits in. Theories spiraled quickly. Some believed Emily had been running from someone, maybe even chased into the cabin, and in desperation had tried to hide in the chimney. Others thought the opposite, that someone had placed her there intentionally, sealing the chimney afterward to ensure she'd never be found. That theory gained weight when the forensics team pointed out that the debris blocking the flue had been layered in a deliberate way, not simply fallen in from above. Emily's family came to claim her remains, their grief tinged with disbelief. For years, they had clung to hope, imagining her injured but alive somewhere, or perhaps having left to start over. The reality, that she had died alone in the cold dark of a chimney in the middle of nowhere, was harder to bear than the uncertainty had ever been. Her sister, Margaret, pressed the sheriff for answers, her voice sharp through her tears. Who did this to her? And why here? The "why here" became its own obsession. The cabin wasn't on any maps. There were no property records, no registered owner. Historical records showed nothing of a structure ever being permitted or built in that location. The most plausible explanation was that it had been erected decades ago by trappers or miners, but even then, its isolation was unusual. To reach it, Nate and Travis had bushwhacked for nearly 3 hours from the nearest logging road. Whoever had brought Emily here, if that was the case, had gone to significant effort. The media caught wind of the story within days, splashing headlines about the chimney mystery across national news. Amateur sleuths dissected every detail online, with some pointing to similarities between Emily's case and other unsolved disappearances in the Rockies. A few went further, suggesting that the carved symbol tied the case to an obscure string of strange deaths in remote cabins dating back decades. For Sheriff Cale, speculation was useless without evidence. He sent the carving's photographs to universities and cultural historians, hoping for some clue. He had the cabin's timbers analyzed to estimate its age. He retraced the possible routes Emily could have taken from the main trail to the cabin, finding no sign she'd ever passed through. It was as if she had been plucked from the mountains and set here deliberately. Winter deepened, burying the clearing under feet of snow. The cabin, now sealed off with crime scene tape, stood silent again, its shadow long in the pale afternoon light. The forest around it kept its secrets, and the mountains remained unmoved, as if they had seen this sort of thing before. Emily Hart had been found, but her story had only grown darker, and in Montana's wilderness, darkness had a way of swallowing the truth whole.